Okay, this lesson is going to be talking about finishing. We already started talking about finishing. We're talking about the two different options for coloring the wood. Now we're going to talk about protecting the wood. But before we jump into that, I'm going to stop for a minute and just talk a little bit about safety. Lots of times we don't think about safety when it comes to finishing, but there are some things that are important to know. A lot of these products that we use can be pretty toxic. Some are safer than others, especially if they're water-based. But you want to be careful about how you use them. Some things you want to be wearing if you're applying a finish is safety glasses so you don't get anything splash in your eyes. Protective clothing. I strongly recommend wearing an apron when you're doing finishing, like especially when dealing with stain and a lot of these things. If they get on your clothes, they're not coming out. We call stain for a reason. You get a splash of stain on your clothes, it's gone, it's done. You're not going to get it out no matter what you put on it. Same with a lot of these products as well. We have rubber gloves to put on. These are actually latex, or not even latex, vinyl gloves. They protect your hands so that you don't get it into your skin. Once in a while, an occasional, get a little stain on your hands, not going to hurt anything. But if you do this often, your skin starts to get sensitized to it, and you get a little bit on there, then if you get some irritation that flares up. So I strongly recommend wearing disposable gloves when you're doing this. Fumes are another thing. You want to work in a well-ventilated area. You don't want to be breathing this stuff constantly because it could do some permanent damage. Sometimes you can feel a little lightheaded and that'll go away, but if you, again, constantly are breathing this stuff, this is not going to be helpful. A lot of these things have a cumulative effect that you don't notice over a long period of time. Rag disposal. When you use rags, even the disposable rags that we've got, throw them into a fireproof garbage can. Do not put them into an open garbage can. Like if you're doing some work in your basement and you have an old garbage can down there and you throw it in there and the garbage can is open, if that was to catch fire, there would be no way for that to be put out. Now, things can spontaneously combust. And if you've never heard of spontaneous combustion, it's a result of the drying process of a lot of these finishes creates heat because it's a chemical reaction in a lot of cases. And a byproduct of a chemical reaction is heat. When you have a rag full of a finish of some kind in a clump, that heat can't dissipate and it makes the reaction happen faster, which creates more heat, and eventually it gets hot enough, it gets to the kindling point of that product, and it ignites without any spark. They call it spontaneous combustion. And it happens easier than you might think. And if you were working in the basement and you threw it in a garbage can and you went up and went to bed and all of a sudden these rags ignited, you can burn your house down, and it has happened where people have died in house fires just from that very thing happening. Very often, on the back of the can, there's warnings about it, but who reads the fine print on the back of the can? Not a lot of people, all right? But at home in my house, I have just the old-fashioned metal garbage can with a lid. I got a small one down in the basement, and that's my garbage can for my work area. And when I'm done with rags and stuff, I put it in there, put the lid on, and if something was to ignite, the metal lid in the metal can is going to contain it, and it'll suffocate, and it'll go back out again. So you should have some safe place to get rid of rags with combustible materials on them. In our shop, we have a fireproof garbage can right in the finishing room. Please put your rags in there. So those are important things. Realize that a lot of these fumes are heavier than air and they settle to the floor. And if you're working in your basement and you have a furnace or a boiler and you got some combustible fumes on the floor and all of a sudden the boiler ignites, the whole basement can be instantly on fire. And it could be even an explosion. So you got to be conscious of those kinds of things. Sometimes in your garage you might have a water heater or something in there too that has an ignition system to it that could create a spark to ignite combustible fumes. And a lot of times you don't smell them because they're hovering near the floor because they're heavier than air. So be conscious of those kinds of things. Safety is an important thing when it comes to finishing. All right, so let's get back to our little chart that we started in the previous video. We talked about coloring. Now we're going to talk about protecting. We said that coloring is an optional step in the finishing process, but protecting is required. The finishing police will come and get you. You got to put some kind of protection on your project. What are you protecting it from? Mostly moisture and dirt. So if I made a beautiful dining room table, right, and didn't put any protective finish on it, and then we all sat down and had a spaghetti dinner, and some of the spaghetti sauce got onto my beautiful table, I go to wipe it up, what's going to happen? It ain't gonna wipe up because that spaghetti sauce is gonna soak into that unprotected wood, right? But if I put a coat of protective finish on it and it seals the wood, now the spaghetti sauce can be wiped up and leave no trace behind. So it's important to put some protection on anything that you make that is made out of wood. Okay? And just like finishing, we broke that into two parts. We're going to break protecting into two parts. And the types of finishes fall into two categories. They're coating and penetrating. In other words, they create a film or they soak in. Soak in, and dry in the wood. Okay? Similar to what we were talking about here, paint creates a film, so it's part of this coating category because it is a protecting layer on here. Remember we said paint kind of crosses the border here. And stain soaks into the wood. Remember we put the stain on, let it soak in, and we wipe off the excess because the stain kind of lives in the wood instead of on the wood. All right? So we have our two categories of protective finishes that we can put on our wood. Okay? The most complicated that we're going to be talking about right now is the group called coating finishes. And on your handout, you're going to notice that I've listed a bunch of them, and I've kind of listed them from the hardest to the softest. Okay? Now, coating finishes, let's just talk about them generally first. They offer good protection to the wood. So it's a kind of a finish you'd probably want to put on something like a dining room table or a coffee table or something you've got to put things on, and you want to have some physical protection, right? Must be because it's a film, as we talked about earlier, it needs to be applied with some kind of a brush or a spray gun of some manner to create that nice even film. And any other stuff that you've done to it, like if you stained it, that has to have dried overnight. You don't want to be putting this on top of something that's still wet. In between coats, and we talked about this earlier, you want to give it a light scuff sand. So if I put on a coat of some kind of a coating finish, after it dries the next day before I put on the second coat, I'm going to give it a light scuff sand. So protecting finishes need 2 coats minimum. And scuff sand between. Before you put the second coat on. By the way, do not scuff sand after the last coat. After the last coat is, you don't want to be putting sandpaper on it because you're going to see the sanding marks. So scuff sand between coats, but not after the last coat. Okay, so let's talk about the coating finishes here. These are the first ones. And we're going to break these down into 4 different types. I used to think they were all the same thing, just different names for the same product, but they're not. The first one I don't have a sample of, but it's varnish. All right? Varnish is the hardest finish. I'm going to make a list here. So, varnish is the hardest. Excuse me. It's alcohol and waterproof. So, ever hear of marine varnish? That's what they put on boats. What do boats sit in? They sit in the water. So it's obviously waterproof. It's also alcohol proof. So if I had an alcoholic beverage and it spilled on something that was covered with alcohol, or with varnish rather, it would not bother it. If I had a bottle of perfume that spilled onto a piece of furniture that had varnish on it, the alcohol in the perfume wouldn't bother it. So that's a good thing. Okay, spar varnish. Sometimes you come across spar varnish. That's a varnish that has UV inhibitors in it, ultraviolet rays. So if you have something that's going to be outside, let's say you're making a sign or something that's going to be outside, a piece of outdoor furniture, you'll want to get some spar varnish, not just regular varnish, but spar varnish, because that will make that product last longer sitting out in the sunlight. If you've ever seen like plastic toys that have sat out in the sun all summer long, by the end of the summer they're kind of bleached out and brittle, and they lose their flexibility. Well, the same thing happens to finishing products. Okay, it sits out in the sun, that sun's going to bake it and make it dried out and brittle over time, and needs to be replaced and sanded off. anybody that owns a wooden boat knows that you're forever sanding and revarnishing a boat. Even with spar varnish on it, eventually it will break down and does need to be sanded off and revarnished. We'll talk about thinners and that later. It is noted on the notes. So varnish is the hardest of the finishes we're going to be talking about, most durable. So if you want something really durable, varnish is a good thing to put on there. A very close second is polyurethane. Now polyurethane really is a type of varnish. True varnish has natural resins. The solid particles in the finish are a natural product. Polyurethane, they're a polymer, they're a plastic. So it's kind of like a plastic version of varnish. So it's a very close second on the hardness scale. Also very, very durable. All right. Polyurethane is probably the most common kind of finish that people put on things. And it kind of comes in two categories. We have oil base and water base. What do I mean by that? Well, oil base has some kind of a solvent base or liquid to it. Water base, the liquid portion, is essentially water. And I have a couple of examples here. These are some cans of polyurethane. This larger can is water-based polyurethane. And if you take a look inside the can, the color is kind of white. All right? And if you were here and could smell it, it's hard to smell through a video, it would smell a lot like latex paint. That's really what it is. Latex paint, like you'd paint your bedroom, is basically water-based polyurethane without any color in it. It's clear. So if you think of a clear latex paint, that's what water-based polyurethane is. When it dries, it tends to dry crystal clear. It doesn't have any tone to it at all. Oil-based polyurethane, which is what these two cans are, looks more like maple syrup or honey, and it has a honey color to it. All right, and it does offer a little bit of tone to the wood. In fact, here's a piece of wood that has two different finishes on it. It's the same piece of pine. This side we put oil-based polyurethane. This side has water-based polyurethane, and you can see the oil-based polyurethane has a amber tone to it, and it looks a little warmer. Where the water-based polyurethane didn't change the color of the wood at all. It's we call it crystal clear. So that's the difference between oil-based and water-based polyurethane. Now cleanup is different too. Water-based polyurethane we clean up with, you guessed it, water. Oil-based polyurethane, you need the correct solvent to clean up oil-based products with. So that's the second type, is polyurethane. The third one is shellac. Now shellac is, and we have a can of shellac right here. A couple of things about shellac. It's, again, a clear finish. My dad made my mom bedroom furniture when they first got married many years ago. And that was the finish that he used at the time, because a lot of these things have developed over the years. But shellac was a very popular finish years ago. But shellac is not alcohol and waterproof. Polyurethane and varnish are. And one time I remember my mom was putting on some perfume and knocked the little bottle over and quickly picked it up and cleaned it up. But as soon as it hit the shellac surface of her dresser, it made a ring, and it damaged the finish. So it's not alcohol and waterproof. But a good thing about shellac is it will stick to anything. So if you like to do furniture refinishing and you strip down the old finish, it's always a good idea to put a coat of shellac on first, because if there's old residues from the finish or from polish or anything on the wood that may cause problems with a new coat of finish, the shellac will stick to it no matter what. But if you put some other finishes on, they may have trouble sticking, and it causes a problem. So it's very often used as a base coat for a new finish. And then if you put a new finish over it that is alcohol and waterproof, well, then the end result will be alcohol and waterproof or resistant. So but shellac is often used as a coating for that. It's also good for sealing out stains. If, let's say I wanted to paint this piece of pine that we just showed you a minute ago, it's got knots in it. Well, if I was to paint over this, the resins of the knot will bleed through, even through this polyurethane. But if I put some shellac over it, there's something about the shellac that seals over things. So a couple of coats of shellac and then a coat of paint, I won't see the knot. If you've ever had a leak in your house and you have a stain in the ceiling, the watermark, excuse me, you try painting over that, you could paint over it 100 times and that stain, for some reason, keeps bleeding through. A little shellac over that stain, let that dry, and that will be done. It'll seal it over and the paint will hide the mark. So shellac is a good base coat. So it's not alcohol or waterproof. It's softer than polyurethane varnish, but it is a good base coat over water stains and knots and those kinds of things. Also, it has a short shelf life. Now, a shelf life is how long it stays usable after you open it, right? And what happens with it is it doesn't dry. So it stays sticky and gummy and it'll just be there forever. So once you open a can of shellac, it's best to buy a small can, if you don't need a lot, because eventually it's going to get to the point where it's not going to be usable. So just be aware of the fact that it has a short shelf life. All right? And then the last one that we're going to talk about is lacquer. And here's a can of lacquer that we have. Lacquer is usually sprayed on. It's used a lot in furniture, in the furniture industry. The nice thing about it is it dries very quickly, and it's repairable. These other finishes, since they're more durable, which you would think would be good, like polyurethane and varnish, if, let's say you were a furniture company and you make an expensive piece of furniture, and in the process of getting it from your factory to the store and from the store to the customer's house, it gets a little ding or a nick. If the customer paid a lot of money for it, they're not going to want a piece of furniture with a ding or a nick in it. They're going to want something that's perfect. So if you had a finish on there that was repairable, you could send somebody out to repair it. But these really durable finishes are extremely difficult to repair. But lacquer is very repairable, so if you put a lacquer finish on something, it makes it fixable and reduces the chance of having to remake something. The other thing is it goes on very quick. When it's sprayed on, it'll dry in 15 minutes and I could put on another coat. So imagine again your factory setting. If I was putting on polyurethane and I needed it to dry overnight, I have to have a very large area to store all the products that I make in a day to dry overnight, and it's got to be dust free. And then let's say I want to put on a second coat, so now I need twice the space for 2 days worth of finishing. And that takes a long time for all that to dry, and you have to control the dust, and that gets expensive. Lacquer dries 15 minutes. In a few hours I could have 2 or 3 or 4 coats of lacquer on there and be ready to put it in a box and ship it out the door within a day. So you can see the advantage of a lacquer finish. And lacquer is a beautiful finish. They do it on acoustic guitars. Very often they'll have a lacquer finish. And it's, again, a very beautiful finish. It tends to, again, not warm up like the polyurethane and varnish does. It's more of a clear finish similar to the water-based polyurethane. But again, you see it a lot in industry. This is a commercial lacquer that we've got right here. And it's usually sprayed on. It dries so fast it's hard to brush on. They do make a brushing lacquer that you could buy. And it has something in it that slows down the drying, so that you can, because if it dries too fast, when you're brushing it out, it's drying before you can get all the brush marks evened out and everything. So it's very difficult to brush regular lacquer, so that's why they make a particular blend just for brushing. But typically it's sprayed. Now let's talk about how you clean up from these things. When you're all done, you're going to apply, if you're applying with a brush of some kind, all right, you need to clean up when you're done. Okay? Water-based polyurethane, we already said you clean up with water. But these other products have solvents, and we have a chart on your handout showing you the different solvents for the different products. But let's just quickly go over them, because the most common solvent is paint thinner. Paint thinner is the correct solvent for varnish and for polyurethane. And the stain that we had before, it's also the correct solvent for that as well. Paint thinner is kind of a nickname. What paint thinner really is mineral spirits. Okay, so that's what paint thinner is. We call it paint thinner because years ago, all the paints, when you painted your house and everything, they were all oil-based paints, and mineral spirits was the solvent for oil-based paint, and it still is. But they called it paint thinner because of what it was commonly used for. Shellac is a different thinner. and that is denatured alcohol. So shellac, the thinner for shellac, let's see if I can balance this up here without causing a problem, is denatured alcohol. You can buy shellac as a solid. It comes as flakes, and you can, because it has a short shelf life, a lot of people who do a lot of finishing buy the shellac in a flake form because it lasts a lot longer. And then they just mix it with denatured alcohol to get the strength and it preserves its quality a lot easier because you can mix it as you need it. All right. So what denatured alcohol is shellac, and if you open up a can of shellac, you'll smell the alcohol smell. It dries very quickly. Shellac dries almost as fast as lacquer. And then lacquer, it's really easy to remember the solvent for lacquer. It's lacquer thinner. So the solvent for lacquer is lacquer thinner. The solvent for water-based polyurethane is water. Most other things are paint thinner. All the oil-based products that are typically out there, a lot of them. And denatured alcohol is unique to shellac. So that's denatured alcohol and shellac are the one you really have to put to memory. But lacquer and lacquer thinner go together. Water and water-based goes together. And paint thinner is everything else, for the most part. So those are your solvents. Now the one thing we didn't talk about is luster. What's luster? Well, luster is the amount of shine something has. And if you've ever gone to the paint store with your parents to pick a paint for your bedroom, they often say, well, what finish or what luster do you want for the paint? Do you want eggshell? Do you want satin? Do you want semi-gloss? And any kind of a coating finish will offer a luster. And I got 2 cans of polyurethane here, the same kind of polyurethane. This one says clear satin, and this one says clear gloss. So gloss, if you put it on properly, a gloss finish, when it's dry, will still look wet. That's what the shine. So luster is the amount of shine. Satin is further down the line on shininess, and it's kind of a soft shine. Okay, there's something in between called semi-gloss, and then you can go past satin, and eggshell is in there. You have flat, which is like no shine at all, like a chalkboard. The old-fashioned blackboards, they were like a flat black color. There's no shine at all on them. So those are the ranges of the shine. That's what we talk about luster. So gloss is the highest shine, flat is the least amount, but you'll often see satin or semi-gloss and gloss. Those are 3 common things you'll see. Any coating finish will have it. Here's the lacquer. You can see this is a gloss sheen on this particular can of lacquer, and this water-based polyurethane is low luster, which is like a satin. It's just another way to say it. Yeah, they're talking about the luster. Okay. Now, so that's the coating. These are the coating finishes, and there's a ton of things, but these are the ones you're going to come across. So you've got hardest to softest, varnish, polyurethane, shellac, and lacquer. And to be honest, I don't know which one is softer, shellac or lacquer, but they were pretty similar. These 2 are very hard, these 2 are pretty soft. Okay, good way to remember. Now the last area is really pretty easy, is the penetrating finishes. These are all the oil finishes. And there's a lot of them. Years ago, when before they knew the chemistry that we know nowadays to make these fancy finishes, they had linseed oil. And they'd make something out of wood, and they'd soak it full of linseed oil, let the linseed oil dry, and the oil and water don't mix, so the linseed oil in the wood would inhibit the moisture from getting in there and kept the product to last a little bit longer. But every so often they had to re-oil it. Okay? Then they kind of chemistry developed, and we came up with all kinds of other oils. For example, there's a product called Danish oil. I'll put some of these up here. This is an oil finish. One that I like a lot, which is called Minwax Antique Oil. There is a product called Tung Oil. And then I also mentioned, like a minute ago, was linseed oil. So you can see anything that ends in the word oil is in that penetrating group. And these products go on a lot like stain. You take a rag, you squirt some out into a can of some kind, dunk a rag in there, saturate the wood with it. Usually you let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then you wipe off the excess. When you do stain, like we talked about earlier, stain usually as soon as you put it on, you can wipe it off right away. But the oil finishes, I know antique oil we use a lot. It says 10 to 15 minutes before you wipe it off. Danish oil, I believe, is the same thing. So, but again, now you're letting the oil go into the wood, soak up as much as it wants, and then you wipe off the excess, and the finish dries in the wood. So technically, if you oiled something and you touched it, you're still touching the wood, kind of. It's just that the wood is saturated with a dried oil. With a coating finish, after it dries, you touch it, you're touching the finish. There's a film of finish between your finger and the piece of wood. So that's the difference. Oil finishes are a lot more delicate, obviously, and they have a more delicate look to them as well. So like if I made like a jewelry box or something like that, or maybe a carving, something that isn't going to have a lot of abuse like a table would, I would probably put an oil finish on it because it's a lighter look, it's a finer look. It's just not as durable, but if I don't need that durability as part of my finish, and I like that lighter look, that's what I might be using. All right, so that's your oil finishes. Let me just take a quick look here, make sure I covered all my bases. You don't usually see luster on oil finishes because there's no film, so there's no flat surface to have different amounts of shine. It's almost always going to be some kind of a soft, satiny kind of a look to them, because oil finishes don't build up a layer like coating finishes do. And I think that covers all of our basic information on finishing. We could go on for hours and days on the kinds of things that there is to know about finishing, but this should give you a good basic understanding. Again, we take finishing, we break it into two parts. You have the coloring side, which is optional, stain or paint, and then you have the protecting side, which is not optional. You have to do it. You have to put some kind of protecting coat on there. If you painted it, you kind of covered yourself because that's a protecting layer as well as a coloring agent. But then you have varnish, polyurethane, shellac, or lacquer that you could put onto coat, or you could put some kind of oil over it. Now these things would easily go over stain, but they're all of these items are here to protect the wood in some manner. Make sure you know what solvents go with different things. Remember we said shellac was denatured alcohol, lacquer was lacquer thinner, water-based polyurethane is water, and pretty much everything else is paint thinner. Varnish, turpentine, you often will see turpentine is a solvent for varnish, but turpentine is similar enough to paint thinner. I think paint thinner would work for regular varnish as well. All the oil finishes, paint thinner. Again, remember I said paint thinner is very often the common solvent for many things. And that's what you would use for cleanup. Again, remember the safety aspect of this. Be careful what you do with rags that are soaked in finish, and make sure you have some kind of protective clothing on so you don't ruin your clothes. And that's the story on finishing.